He aggressively kicked his heavily pregnant wife completely out, entirely onto the freezing streets, completely without a single penny, arrogantly demanding she abort their biological son simply to secure a massive corporate merger. 7 agonizing years later, the multimillionaire CEO violently discovered that his abandoned son was actively being raised completely in a highly secure fortress, entirely by his absolute, most terrifying billionaire rival. Welcome back, my beautiful family. If you love explosive stories about massive betrayal, fierce mothers, and the absolute ultimate, terrifying revenge, you are exactly where you need to be. Before we dive into this chilling story of power and redemption, please smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know what you would do in Lucia's highly terrifying situation down in the comments. Let's get directly into the fortified legacy. The fortified legacy. The architect of ruin. When an absolutely perfect, highly curated life violently crumbles entirely into a million microscopic pieces, it happens entirely with exactly 3 heavy words. He confidently stood perfectly, completely before her. The highly arrogant master architect entirely of her absolutely perfect, flawless life. And completely with exactly 3 heavy words. He violently, brutally, tore absolutely all of it completely down. I am actively leaving you. Lucia Navarro physically felt the highly expensive, crystal champagne glass violently slip completely through her trembling fingers, violently shattering completely onto the highly polished, imported marble floor. A highly perfect, incredibly violent metaphor entirely for her fragile heart. She was exactly 7 agonizing months heavily pregnant, actively expecting her biological son, the absolute, undeniable heir, entirely to the massive Montejo fortune. A massive, multi-billion-dollar fortune that her absolute own highly elite family had generously, heavily helped actively build. But her arrogant husband, Mateo, had highly successfully found a brand new, highly strategic corporate partner, a significantly wealthier, highly connected elite heiress. He absolutely did not entirely just arrogantly want a highly clean divorce. He aggressively wanted to completely, violently erase her and her biological son completely from existence. Violently thrown completely out entirely onto the freezing streets and absolutely left completely without a single, pathetic penny. She miraculously found a highly unexpected, massive ally entirely in the absolute only terrifying man that Mateo fiercely, violently, feared significantly more than absolutely anyone else in the massive world. His highly ruthless, elite billionaire rival, Gabriel Valdez. This absolutely isn't entirely just a highly dramatic story, completely about toxic betrayal. It is the highly explosive, powerful story, entirely of exactly how the fierce, unconditional love, entirely of a brave mother, violently forged completely in the absolute fire, entirely of total ruin. And the highly absolute, unbreakable promise, entirely of a highly terrifying enemy, violently born completely from a highly forgotten, massive debt. Aggressively built a highly impenetrable fortress, completely around an innocent child, that the absolute most powerful, arrogant man, entirely in the massive city, would highly desperately attempt to violently tear completely down and catastrophically fail. The gilded cage, the highly sparkling, massive crystal chandeliers entirely at the elite Metamorphosis charity gala beautifully dripped bright light, exactly like pure liquid diamonds, flawlessly casting a highly warm golden glow completely over the absolute highest elite entirely of the massive city. Lucia Navarro, completely with exactly one soft hand, resting highly protectively, perfectly over the highly prominent, beautiful curve entirely of her massive belly. Intensely watched her handsome husband, Mateo Montejo, confidently move completely through the crowded ballroom. He smoothly moved completely with the highly predatory, absolute grace, entirely of a lethal apex predator. His highly charming, massive smile was an incredibly, meticulously calibrated weapon that flawlessly disarmed elite competitors and toxically charmed massive billionaires. He was incredibly, devastatingly handsome, and entirely for the absolute last 5 agonizing years, he had absolutely been entirely hers. Her massive life was an absolute, flawless masterpiece, entirely of highly curated perfection. The highly sprawling, multi-million-dollar luxury penthouse perfectly overlooking the massive city park. The highly exclusive, expensive weekends entirely in the beautiful Riviera Maya. The massive walk-in closets completely stuffed entirely with highly expensive, bespoke suits and elite haute couture designer dresses. Absolutely all of it was an absolute, highly calculated part entirely of the massive Montejo brand, a highly toxic brand meticulously built entirely upon Mateo's highly sharp, ruthless intelligence and the highly solid, massive financial foundation entirely of Lucia's highly powerful, old money family. The Navarros. Her loving father had highly approvingly viewed Mateo's massive, blinding ambition exactly as a highly perfect, elite match completely for the massive family legacy. He had highly generously sponsored the highly arrogant boy completely from the absolute wrong, poor side entirely of the tracks. He had generously given him the highly massive initial capital to successfully start completely up. He had actively consolidated massive power, and he had highly generously handed completely over his absolute, most highly prized, beautiful treasure entirely to him, his beautiful daughter, your highly resplendent, massive treasure, a highly sharp, toxic voice stated directly beside her. It was Beatriz Suarez, a highly toxic, elite woman whose aging face was pulled exactly as incredibly tight, exactly as her highly exclusive social circle. Lucia highly politely offered her a highly courteous, fake smile. It is absolutely just the highly healthy pregnancy glow, Beatrice, or at least exactly so they highly kindly tell me. Well, it flawlessly suits you significantly better than the absolute vast majority. Mateo absolutely must be incredibly thrilled, a biological son, to proudly continue the highly arrogant name. He absolutely is, Lucia stated smoothly, her piercing gaze flawlessly finding him completely again, entirely on the absolute other side entirely of the massive ballroom. He was actively engaged entirely in a highly animated, seemingly highly friendly conversation, completely with the highly infamous massive telecommunications magnate, Mr. Castro. Perfectly standing exactly beside Castro was his highly elegant daughter, Sophia, a highly cold, elite woman who visually looked exactly as if she had been flawlessly sculpted entirely out of freezing ice and highly expensive diamonds. She loudly laughed entirely at absolutely something highly amusing Mateo casually said, her beautiful head playfully tilted, a highly striking scarlet mouth perfectly set against incredibly pale skin, a highly sharp pang entirely of deep unease, a highly toxic feeling that had violently become way too incredibly familiar completely lately. Aggressively tightened Lucia's fragile chest. It was the highly frequent, highly suspicious, late nights entirely at the massive office, the highly hushed, secret phone calls that he violently, abruptly ended the absolute microsecond she confidently walked completely into the room. The highly strange, cloying smell entirely of a highly expensive perfume that absolutely wasn't hers, that faintly, persistently clung entirely to his highly expensive tailored jackets. He absolutely always possessed a highly plausible, calculated explanation. A massive deal was aggressively closing. A highly catastrophic crisis was actively being violently averted. You profoundly know exactly how it is, Lucia. To actively stay perfectly on the absolute top, you can absolutely never, ever peacefully rest. And she, desperately wanting to actively be the highly supportive, perfect wife. The flawless partner, had highly naively accepted absolutely all of it. She had aggressively pushed her highly terrifying, massive doubts completely into the highly dark, hidden corners entirely of her brilliant mind, fiercely focusing entirely instead, completely on the beautiful nursery, which was being meticulously painted entirely in highly soft, calming blues and warm creams, fiercely focusing entirely on the highly fragile, beautiful little life miraculously fluttering completely inside her. Her piercing eyes rapidly swept completely across the massive room and violently landed completely on a highly solitary figure standing perfectly, completely alone, perfectly near the large French doors, entirely opening completely onto the massive terrace. Gabriel Valdez, the absolute only terrifying man entirely in massive Mexico City, who could highly effortlessly make the arrogant Mateo violently flinch completely in pure fear. Valdez was highly terrifying, massive new money, an absolute, highly lethal ghost who had violently emerged completely from the dark shadows entirely of Silicon Valley exactly 5 agonizing years completely ago, and who had absolutely been highly systematically, violently, dismantling absolutely all of his elite competitors completely ever since. His massive, highly public rivalry completely with Mateo was highly legendary, entirely on Wall Street, exactly where Mateo was highly polished, fake charm. Gabriel was highly brutal, absolute efficiency. He absolutely did not politely shake soft hands. He violently conquered. He visually looked incredibly different, completely from the highly polished photos entirely in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. Significantly taller, significantly darker. A highly terrifying, absolute intensity violently radiated completely from him that physically seemed to aggressively suck absolutely all the heavy air completely out of his highly immediate, massive surroundings. He absolutely wasn't happily smiling or highly actively socializing. He was simply intensely observing. His piercing gaze was a highly analytical, massive spotlight that meticulously scanned absolutely everything for exactly one highly terrifying, microscopic second. His highly piercing, freezing eyes violently met hers completely across the highly crowded, massive room. There was absolutely zero pure warmth entirely in them, only a highly brief, massive flash entirely of absolutely something she literally could not completely decipher. Absolute recognition, perhaps, or was it pure, unadulterated pity? She violently shivered and aggressively looked completely away, profoundly feeling exactly as if he had flawlessly, vividly seen completely, straight through her highly carefully constructed, fake happiness, directly down entirely to the highly anxious, terrified heart, actively beating completely underneath. Mateo finally, highly smoothly extracted completely himself, entirely from the highly powerful Castros, and confidently returned directly to her beautiful side, his massive hand gently landing perfectly on the highly delicate curve entirely of her lower back. "Are you happily enjoying the massive party, my beautiful love? It is a highly lovely elite event," she stated, desperately attempting to flawlessly maintain her beautiful tone, incredibly light. "You and Sofia Castro highly apparently visually seem to actively possess a highly massive amount entirely to enthusiastically talk completely about." A highly brief, toxic flash entirely of pure annoyance violently crossed his handsome face completely before actively being flawlessly replaced completely by his highly signature fake smile. Conrad is a highly necessary evil, and Sofia is his highly protective gatekeeper. It is absolutely just highly lucrative business, Lucia. Absolutely always pure business. He smoothly leaned completely in and gently kissed her entirely on the pale cheek. But his piercing eyes were absolutely already highly actively scanning the massive crowd entirely for his highly next massive target. The highly fake kiss physically felt incredibly cold. A highly performative, pathetic gesture, exclusively for the massive audience they were absolutely always highly actively playing completely for. Lucia notices red flags. What is the biggest red flag you've ever ignored in a relationship? Let us know below. The brutal eviction, significantly later that exact night. Exactly as their highly expensive luxury car smoothly glided completely through the highly gleaming, busy streets entirely of Manhattan. The highly heavy silence completely between them was incredibly, highly oppressive. Lucia desperately wanted to actively ask entirely about the highly suspicious late nights, entirely about the highly faint, sweet smell, entirely of expensive gardenias, perfectly on his strong neck. But the heavy words absolutely refused to physically form. Actively asking explicitly meant actively being completely, 100%, prepared entirely for a highly terrifying answer she absolutely wasn't completely sure she could miraculously survive, back completely inside their massive penthouse. The highly toxic silence aggressively stretched, violently amplified completely by the highly cavernous massive rooms and the highly panoramic stunning view entirely of the massive city that absolutely never, ever slept. Matteo aggressively loosened his expensive silk tie, actively turning his broad back completely to her, exactly as he intensely looked completely out, entirely through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The massive multi-billion-dollar deal completely with Castro is actively going to be completely, utterly massive, Lucia, he stated, his deep voice incredibly distant. It is the absolute, highly final piece. It will flawlessly make us completely, utterly untouchable. Us. The heavy word sounded incredibly strange. A highly archaic relic entirely of a highly simple time, exactly when she had foolishly believed it explicitly meant exactly the two entirely of them. Now, she profoundly felt it explicitly meant absolutely only him and his blinding, toxic ambition. "That is absolutely wonderful, Nate," she softly replied. He absolutely did not smoothly turn completely around. "I desperately need you to profoundly understand exactly what is actively at massive stake. The highly absolute level entirely of massive commitment that is actively going to absolutely be fiercely required." "I completely understand," she whispered softly, her soft hand gently resting completely on her massive belly. "We absolutely both completely understand." For a highly long, agonizing moment, he said absolutely nothing. The absolute only sound was the highly faint, distant hum, entirely of the massive city far completely below. When he finally, smoothly turned completely around, his handsome face was a highly toxic mask that she absolutely did not recognize. The highly charming, perfect husband was completely gone, flawlessly replaced completely by the highly ruthless, toxic CEO. There was absolutely zero pure love entirely in his piercing eyes. Only a highly final, terrifyingly chilling, massive calculation. The highly gilded cage she had beautifully called absolute home was actively about to violently become her highly permanent, dark tomb. The highly agonizing following week violently passed completely in a highly blurry haze, entirely of highly forced, fake normality. Matteo was significantly more highly distant than absolutely ever before. A highly pathetic ghost, entirely, in their highly opulent, massive home. He smoothly moved completely with a highly silent, incredibly deliberate purpose that violently put Lucia completely on high edge. He was aggressively orchestrating absolutely something massive. She profoundly knew it, but she frantically clung entirely to the highly pathetic hope that it was absolutely just the massive Castro deal. The highly all-consuming, massive corporate venture that he toxically claimed was absolutely entirely for them. The highly fragile illusion completely, violently, shattered entirely on a highly gloomy Tuesday afternoon. Completely with the massive sky the exact, highly depressing color entirely of a faded bruise, violently threatening highly freezing rain. Lucia was peacefully in the beautiful nursery, meticulously, lovingly folding a highly tiny, expensive cashmere sweater exactly when Matteo confidently entered. He absolutely made zero polite comments entirely about the beautiful room, entirely about the highly serene, hand-painted massive mural entirely of a beautiful forest that she had highly expensively commissioned, or entirely about the highly massive mountain entirely of highly expensive baby gifts, completely from her highly ostentatious, elite baby shower. He simply stood perfectly, completely in the heavy doorway. His highly bespoke, expensive suit, visually looking highly absurdly, completely out, entirely of place, completely amidst the highly soft, pure innocence, entirely of the beautiful room. "We desperately need to actively talk," he stated. His deep tone was incredibly flat, completely devoid entirely of absolutely any emotion. It was the exact, highly terrifying voice he actively used entirely in elite board meetings, exactly right before aggressively dismantling an entire, failing department. A highly freezing dread violently washed completely over her. "Okay," she stated, completely stopping her soft hand perfectly over the tiny sweater. "Is absolutely something highly wrong completely with the massive deal? The massive deal is perfectly fine. The massive deal is absolutely flawless." He slowly walked significantly further, completely into the beautiful room. His highly expensive Italian leather shoes, completely silent, entirely on the highly plush, expensive carpet. He completely stopped perfectly, right next, completely to the beautiful crib, gently running exactly one massive hand completely over the highly smooth, polished wood. This, absolutely all entirely of this, is a highly massive complication. A highly massive complication. Lucia's beautiful voice was a highly faint, fragile whisper. "Nate, this is the beautiful room entirely of our biological son, our beautiful baby." He finally intensely looked directly at her, and his piercing eyes were exactly as freezing gray and highly cold, exactly as the massive storm violently gathering completely outside. I am actively leaving you, Lucia." The heavy words absolutely did not logically register completely at first. They were absolutely just highly disconnected sounds, completely devoid entirely of any massive meaning. She stared blankly directly at him, desperately waiting entirely for the highly dramatic punchline, entirely for the highly cruel, toxic joke to finally, completely end. But his highly toxic expression remained completely unchanged, a highly freezing mask entirely of grim, absolute finality. "What exactly do you highly mean you are actively leaving me?" "I have officially filed entirely for a highly rapid divorce," he repeated, aggressively cutting absolutely every single heavy word, completely with highly brutal precision. "My elite lawyer will highly aggressively contact yours." Lucia physically felt absolutely all the massive strength, violently drained completely from her weak legs. She frantically grabbed the heavy changing table entirely for absolute support. The beautiful room aggressively began to violently spin. Entirely because of exactly who? Is it officially Sofia Castro?" The heavy name physically tasted exactly like highly lethal poison, entirely on her dry tongue. He actively had the highly bare decency to violently look completely away, his piercing eyes violently landing completely on the massive cityscape perfectly beyond the large window. "Sofia and I are officially, rapidly getting married. Her highly powerful father has officially named me a highly full, equal partner entirely in Castro Telecom. This highly massive merger absolutely isn't entirely just highly lucrative business, Lucia. It is an absolute, highly powerful dynasty. The highly brazen, massive audacity. The incredibly cold, highly transactional, toxic nature entirely of his massive betrayal violently stole absolutely all her heavy breath completely away. He was aggressively trading her completely in, violently exchanging his beautiful family completely for a significantly better, highly massive business deal, a massive dynasty. And exactly what about our beautiful family? What exactly about your biological son?" Her beautiful voice violently broke. Hot tears finally, aggressively blurred her blurred vision. "The beautiful baby violently changes highly massive things," he stated, slowly turning completely back entirely toward her. His handsome face was highly firm, incredibly resolute. "Sofia's highly elite family is incredibly, highly particular. A biological child completely from a highly previous marriage. Highly, especially, exactly one who will actively be born, so incredibly, highly close completely to our absolute own, highly pristine union, would absolutely be a highly massive embarrassment. A highly messy, toxic loose end. A loose end," she violently shrieked, the highly agonizing sound incredibly raw and highly hurtful. "He is officially your biological son. He is an absolute part entirely of you. That is exactly precisely why absolutely all entirely of this absolutely must be actively handled highly cleanly," Matteo aggressively continued, violently lowering his deep voice completely to a highly low, conspiratorial tone. Exactly as if he were highly calmly discussing a highly aggressive, hostile corporate takeover. "Absolutely not. The absolute, massive destiny entirely of his biological son. I possess a highly generous proposal. I am completely prepared entirely to highly generously offer you a highly massive, incredibly generous settlement. Significantly more than enough entirely for you to highly comfortably live. To safely go completely to a brand new place. To beautifully start, completely over. I absolutely do not fiercely want your massive dirty money, Matteo. I fiercely want my loving husband. I fiercely want a true father entirely for my innocent son. You absolutely are not actively listening," he hissed violently, aggressively taking exactly one highly threatening step significantly closer. The highly fake, charming mask entirely of himself was completely, permanently gone, flawlessly revealing the highly toxic, ugly monster completely underneath. The highly generous settlement is strictly contingent entirely on exactly one massive thing: that you violently terminate the highly inconvenient pregnancy. The heavy air violently rushed completely out of her burning lungs, entirely in exactly one single, highly ragged, agonizing gasp. The beautiful room violently tilted. For exactly one massive moment, she genuinely thought she might actively faint. He was aggressively, highly toxically asking her to violently murder her innocent son, to violently erase the absolute last, living, beautiful piece entirely of the pure love she genuinely thought they had beautifully shared. Absolutely all entirely, for the highly pathetic sake, entirely, of his highly toxic ambition. "Get the hell completely out," she whispered incredibly softly, the heavy words violently trembling completely with a massive rage, so incredibly deep that she profoundly felt it could violently shatter her fragile bones. "Lucia, be highly reasonable. An innocent child will absolutely only violently tie you completely to a highly toxic past that is absolutely already completely over. This is a highly clean, massive slate entirely for absolutely both of us. You can absolutely be completely free." "Get the hell out!" she screamed violently, aggressively grabbing a highly heavy, expensive porcelain lamp completely from the small side table and violently hurling it directly at his handsome head. It violently crashed entirely against the hard wall, exactly right, perfectly behind his arrogant head. The highly loud sound entirely of the violently shattered ceramics flawlessly echoing the absolute destruction entirely in the beautiful room, and entirely in her fragile heart. He absolutely didn't even violently flinch. He simply smoothly adjusted his expensive tie, his highly toxic expression aggressively hardening completely into exactly one entirely of absolute, total contempt. "I clearly see that you are actively going to absolutely be incredibly difficult. I genuinely hoped to highly efficiently handle this completely with absolute dignity." "Dignity? You confidently walk completely into our innocent baby's beautiful room and highly arrogantly ask me to violently murder him entirely for your highly toxic career. And you toxically speak entirely of absolute dignity." Her fragile body violently shook completely with massive sobs. A highly violent storm, entirely of agonizing pain and pure fury, actively erupting completely inside her. "Fine," he stated, his deep voice exactly like freezing ice. "Have it exactly your highly pathetic way. But do absolutely not arrogantly think entirely for a single, microscopic second that you will successfully get absolutely anything completely from me. Our highly complex prenuptial agreement is completely, 100%, unbreakable. Absolutely something that your absolute own arrogant father highly insisted entirely upon. Every single massive asset, every single highly lucrative stock option entirely of Montejo Consolidated is legally entirely in my absolute name. The massive company was violently failing exactly when we happily married. I am the absolute one who miraculously made it exactly what it truly is. You will violently leave this highly toxic marriage completely with exactly what you highly pathetically brought completely into it. The highly arrogant Navarro name, and absolutely not incredibly much else. The massive penthouse, the luxury cars, the massive accounts. Absolutely all entirely of them are strictly corporate assets. He was violently, aggressively cutting her completely off, ruthlessly leaving her completely stranded. He had highly maliciously used the massive money and highly elite connections entirely of her powerful family to flawlessly build his highly arrogant empire. And exactly now, he was violently throwing her completely aside entirely, with absolutely nothing. "My loving father fiercely trusted you," she violently choked out. "Your arrogant father is completely dead," Matteo stated completely with chilling, absolute finality. "He successfully made a highly terrible, pathetic investment. Exactly now. I am highly efficiently correcting it." He smoothly turned completely around and confidently walked completely out entirely of the beautiful nursery, ruthlessly leaving her completely, utterly alone, entirely in the absolute middle, entirely of the highly shattered rubble, entirely of her massive future. She heavily sank completely to the hard floor, her soft hands violently wrapped completely around her massive belly. The incredibly tiny, completely innocent life beautifully growing inside her. The absolute only real, massive thing that miraculously remained entirely in a massive world that had literally just been violently stripped completely of absolutely all its pure truth and absolute beauty. The freezing rain finally, violently, broke completely loose entirely outside, aggressively lashing completely against the large windows, entirely. While Lucia Navarro sat heavily, entirely on the hard floor, entirely of a beautiful room, meticulously built, entirely for a biological son, who would exactly now absolutely never, ever completely know his true father. And she violently cried. Matteo literally demanded she abort their baby for a settlement. Is this the most evil thing a husband can do? Tell us below. The descent into the abyss, the agonizing days that violently followed were an absolute, highly toxic masterclass, entirely in systematic, pure cruelty. Matteo, highly faithful entirely to his highly toxic word, aggressively moved completely with the highly rapid, incredibly impersonal, lethal efficiency entirely of a highly ruthless corporate raider actively dismantling a massive failing company. The absolute first highly terrifying notification was a highly formal email, completely from the massive building management, highly politely informing her that the highly lucrative corporate lease entirely on the luxury penthouse was actively being violently terminated, and that she officially possessed exactly 30 short days to legally vacate the massive premises. The highly massive joint bank accounts were instantly, legally frozen, then aggressively completely emptied. The highly expensive, elite credit cards were violently declined. The highly massive black luxury car and her private driver permanently, mysteriously, disappeared. Her massive world, exactly once a highly limitless, beautiful horizon entirely of elite privilege, violently shrank completely down entirely to the highly pathetic size, entirely of exactly a few cheap cardboard boxes. The highly elite society friends who had highly enthusiastically toasted completely to her, entirely at her highly extravagant baby shower, exactly now actively, toxically, averted their highly judgmental gazes entirely in the highly few places she absolutely still actively frequented. Their highly toxic whispers aggressively followed her exactly like a highly freezing, bitter wind. She was absolutely no longer Lucia Navarro Montejo, the highly elegant, perfect wife entirely of a massive titan. She was exactly now a highly pathetic scandal, a highly toxic cautionary tale, a highly scorned woman, and infinitely, significantly worse, a highly pathetic woman who had violently been completely left entirely in absolute poverty. In their highly elite, toxic world, absolute poverty was the absolute, only completely unforgivable, massive sin. She agonizingly packed the beautiful nursery entirely herself. Every single tiny, adorable outfit and highly soft baby blanket was absolutely another highly sharp, lethal dagger completely into her fragile heart. She was a highly pathetic ghost, actively haunting the highly empty shell entirely of her absolute own life. Heavily surrounded entirely by highly expensive objects that absolutely no longer legally belonged completely to her, the massive city she had exactly once proudly considered her absolute kingdom, exactly now physically felt incredibly alien and highly hostile. Every single towering skyscraper actively seemed to highly toxically mock her. A massive, looming monument completely to the absolute power and massive wealth that had been violently, maliciously stolen completely from her. Her highly loyal lawyer, a highly kind, but incredibly exhausted older man, explicitly named Mr. Robles, who had highly faithfully served her powerful family entirely for exactly 40 agonizing years, clearly laid completely out the highly stark, brutal reality. The highly complex prenuptial agreement is an absolute, impenetrable fortress, Lucia. Your powerful father highly aggressively helped flawlessly draft it entirely to fiercely protect the massive family assets, entirely in the highly unlikely event that the beautiful marriage completely failed. The highly bitter, toxic irony is that Matteo has completely, maliciously twisted it. He has highly successfully, legally argued that, entirely because he aggressively absorbed Navarro Industries completely into Montejo Consolidated, and then miraculously grew the massive company completely exponentially. Absolutely all the massive assets are exactly now legally considered entirely his absolute own creation. Your powerful father's highly massive original investment is absolutely now a highly pathetic pittance, entirely in comparison, completely to the massive company's highly current, astronomical valuation. So, I successfully get absolutely nothing? She asked, her beautiful voice incredibly hollow. He is legally, federally obligated entirely to aggressively provide massive child support exactly once the beautiful baby is officially born, Mr. Robles stated. A highly small, pathetic mercy entirely in a massive sea, entirely of total devastation. But Matteo is absolutely already aggressively laying the highly toxic groundwork entirely to violently fight completely for absolute, full custody. Highly falsely alleging that you are completely emotionally unstable and highly financially completely incapable entirely of actively caring entirely for a highly vulnerable child. The massive cruelty was absolutely breathtaking. He absolutely would not generously help her, but he would highly maliciously use her highly terrifying desperation completely against her, entirely to violently steal her innocent son. With the highly pathetic small amount entirely of money she legally had entirely in a highly secure personal account completely from entirely before the massive marriage. She desperately rented a highly tiny, highly depressing one-bedroom apartment entirely in a highly grim, dangerous part entirely of Brooklyn. A massive, entirely different world, completely away. Entirely from the highly gleaming, massive spires entirely of Manhattan. The heavy air was incredibly thick, completely with the highly toxic smell entirely of cheap exhaust fumes and highly greasy street food. Highly loud, wailing sirens, completely in the freezing night, violently replaced the highly soft, beautiful hum entirely of the luxury penthouse's elite climate control. It was an absolute, highly terrifying, humiliating freefall. She frantically sold her highly expensive jewelry, exactly piece, completely by highly agonizing piece. The highly massive diamond earrings that Matteo had expensively gifted her entirely for their absolute first anniversary, flawlessly paid entirely for exactly 3 short months, entirely of cheap rent. The highly beautiful pearl necklace, completely from her loving grandmother, successfully covered her highly initial, critical doctor's visits entirely for the beautiful baby. Every single highly painful transaction physically felt exactly as if she were violently selling a highly precious, beautiful piece entirely of her highly toxic past, entirely of herself. One highly freezing, rainy afternoon, incredibly heavily pregnant, and completely, utterly, emotionally exhausted. She stood perfectly entirely in a highly crowded, cheap supermarket, completely with her highly basic items perfectly on the moving conveyor belt. A highly cheap carton entirely of milk, a highly simple loaf entirely of bread, exactly a few cheap eggs, highly essential prenatal vitamins. The highly pathetic total successfully amounted entirely to exactly $27.42. She nervously swiped her cheap debit card. A highly massive, violent heat, entirely of pure shame, rapidly crept completely up her pale neck. She frantically tried it completely again. The highly pathetic account was completely, utterly empty. She had highly catastrophically miscalculated. "Ma'am?" the highly annoyed cashier asked. His deep voice heavily tinged completely with a highly sharp edge, entirely of pure impatience. The highly busy people actively in line directly behind her aggressively began to loudly, toxically mutter. Lucia's beautiful eyes violently filled completely with hot tears. She frantically fumbled completely in her cheap purse, her soft hands violently trembling exactly as she frantically searched entirely for a highly few loose bills that she profoundly knew absolutely were not completely there. She was violently forced entirely to highly humiliatingly leave the cheap groceries completely on the hard counter, desperately muttering a highly pathetic, broken apology exactly as she frantically fled completely from the busy store. The highly sympathetic and highly toxic, judgmental glares, entirely of complete strangers, violently burning completely into her fragile back. She walked highly aimlessly, entirely for agonizing blocks, completely in the freezing rain, absolutely not fiercely caring that she was completely soaked directly to the freezing bone. The highly crushing feeling entirely of total, complete humiliation. A highly cold, incredibly hard knot, violently twisting completely in her heavy stomach. She was actively going to miraculously bring an innocent child entirely into this massive world. And she absolutely couldn't even actively afford entirely to successfully buy cheap milk that exact night. She sat heavily, entirely in the pitch-black darkness, completely in her highly tiny, completely unfamiliar apartment. The highly chaotic sounds entirely of the massive city, an incredibly oppressive, loud roar. The highly official eviction notice entirely from the luxury penthouse had officially arrived that exact morning. A highly cold, highly official federal document that flawlessly marked the highly definitive, absolute end entirely of her beautiful old life. She was completely, utterly alone, violently stripped entirely of her absolute identity, her massive security, and her absolute dignity. She had successfully hit absolute rock bottom. The massive, catastrophic fall was completely, utterly complete. She fiercely held her massive belly, the highly soft, beautiful kicks entirely of the tiny baby. A highly powerful, beautiful reminder entirely of the absolute, only massive thing that Matteo absolutely, could not violently take, completely away entirely from her. It was absolutely all she miraculously had completely left, as blinding desperation aggressively threatened entirely to violently swallow her completely whole. She fiercely made a highly silent, absolute promise entirely to the innocent son she absolutely hadn't even miraculously met yet. I will absolutely not generously let him violently break us. I will fiercely find a highly possible way. But exactly as she intensely looked completely out the highly thin window, entirely at the freezing rain, entirely, for the absolute first time completely in her entire life, she possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea exactly how. Lucia is completely broke and homeless. Who do you think will come to her rescue? Drop your guesses below. The unexpected ally. Exactly 3 agonizing weeks completely before her highly anticipated due date. The highly terrifying, absolute final eviction notice officially arrived. It was a highly stark, terrifying warning. Completely with highly bright red letters aggressively taped perfectly to the highly cheap door entirely of her pathetic apartment. A highly public toxic declaration entirely of her massive failure. Blinding panic, incredibly cold and razor sharp, violently seized her completely. She possessed absolutely nowhere entirely to safely go. Her highly pathetic remaining funds were miraculously almost completely exhausted, and the highly terrifying prospect entirely of successfully finding a brand new, cheap apartment completely in her highly vulnerable condition, completely without absolutely any income, and completely without absolutely any highly respectable references, was completely, utterly impossible. She frantically spent the highly agonizing morning entirely on the cheap phone, actively calling highly crowded women's shelters, her beautiful voice incredibly thick, completely with pure, unadulterated shame. Absolutely all entirely of them were completely, utterly full, as she sat heavily entirely on her highly worn, cheap sofa. The highly terrifying, massive reality entirely of actively giving birth, completely on the highly dangerous freezing streets violently looming entirely over her. There was a highly sharp, highly authoritative knock entirely on the heavy door. Her massive heart violently leapt, toxically assuming it was the highly angry landlord or a highly aggressive city sheriff. She violently ignored it, desperately hoping they would simply highly eventually leave. The heavy knock aggressively sounded completely again, significantly louder. This highly specific time, significantly more highly insistent. With a highly massive, incredibly deep sigh, she slowly stood completely up, highly heavily, and agonizingly dragged herself completely to the heavy door, cautiously looking completely through the tiny peephole. A highly imposing man, flawlessly wearing a highly impeccable, incredibly dark, bespoke suit, confidently stood perfectly entirely in the highly gloomy, dirty hallway. For exactly one highly brief moment, she absolutely did not vividly recognize him. Then, her blood violently turned completely to freezing ice. It was officially Gabriel Valdez. Her brilliant mind violently raced. Exactly what the hell was he actively doing completely here? Exactly how the hell had he successfully found her? Was exactly this absolutely some highly terrifying, brand new, cruel game entirely from Mateo, aggressively sending his absolute arch-rival perfectly here, entirely to toxically gloat, entirely over her total ruin? Her highly fierce protective instincts violently flared completely to absolute life, and she aggressively unbolted the highly cheap lock, cautiously opening the heavy door absolutely only exactly a highly few short inches. "What exactly do you fiercely want?" she demanded violently. her beautiful voice significantly stronger than she actually physically felt. Gabriel Valdez's piercing eyes. The exact same, highly intense, incredibly analytical eyes she vividly remembered completely from the massive gala. Meticulously took entirely in her highly pathetic appearance, her highly worn, cheap maternity dress, the blinding fear completely in her beautiful expression, the highly dilapidated, cheap apartment highly visible, completely behind her. He absolutely did not toxically mock her. He absolutely did not maliciously smile. His handsome face was a highly impenetrable, stoic mask. "Mrs. Montejo," he stated, his deep voice a highly low, powerful baritone. "May I safely speak completely with you?" "It is officially Navarro," she violently corrected him highly sharply. "And I possess absolutely nothing completely to explicitly say completely to you. You are officially a highly toxic friend entirely of my highly toxic husband. Your highly toxic ex-husband," he smoothly clarified. A highly subtle, but incredibly significant distinction. "And Mateo Montejo and I are absolutely not, and absolutely have never, ever actively been highly loyal friends. Quite exactly the absolute contrary." He violently paused. "I am officially right here entirely, because completely of your highly respected father, Roberto Navarro." The highly unexpected mention entirely of her loving father, tragically dead exactly 3 agonizing years, completely ago, was a massive, blinding shock that completely, momentarily, violently disarmed her. "My loving father? He was officially my elite mentor," Gabriel stated incredibly simply. "When I was exactly 19 young years old, and successfully possessed absolutely nothing completely more than a highly half-baked, massive business plan entirely for a highly ambitious software company. He vividly saw absolutely something highly massive entirely in me. He generously gave me a highly massive initial seed investment. Absolutely not completely from his massive corporate company, but entirely from his absolute own, highly private pocket. He actively made me fiercely promise absolutely never, ever, to explicitly mention it. Entirely so I could successfully build my absolute own massive name. That highly generous investment was the absolute, highly massive foundation entirely of absolutely everything I successfully possess, completely today. I officially owe him a highly massive debt that I can absolutely never, ever, truly successfully repay." Lucia stared blankly directly at him, completely speechless. Her loving father had absolutely possessed a highly massive gift entirely for successfully finding and actively nurturing highly brilliant young talent. But he had absolutely never, ever explicitly mentioned Gabriel Valdez. This highly terrifying, powerful man. This highly ruthless corporate titan violently feared completely by absolutely everyone, was an absolute, flawless product entirely of her loving father's highly quiet, massive generosity. I have been highly actively following exactly what Mateo has violently done, completely to you. Gabriel aggressively continued, his piercing gaze utterly unshakable. Exactly what he is actively doing is absolutely not entirely just highly immoral. It is a highly toxic, massive profanation entirely of your loving father's massive legacy. Roberto Navarro successfully built his massive company entirely on absolute integrity. Mateo is violently destroying it completely with highly toxic greed, and he is highly aggressively attempting to violently destroy your innocent son. "Why exactly are you actively here?" she asked completely again, her beautiful voice significantly softer. "This highly specific time, I am actively here entirely to highly generously offer you a highly massive proposal, he stated firmly. I desperately want to actively help you, absolutely not entirely out of pathetic pity, but entirely out of a highly profound sense, entirely of absolute honor, directly toward the exact man who miraculously helped me. I profoundly know that you are actively facing highly imminent eviction. I profoundly know that your highly pathetic funds are completely gone. I profoundly know that Matteo actively plans to violently sue you completely for absolute custody the exact, precise moment the innocent child is officially born. Lucia leaned heavily, completely against the highly cheap doorframe. The massive, crushing weight entirely of her heavy pregnancy suddenly physically feeling incredibly immense. What exact, specific kind entirely of massive proposal? I legally own a highly secluded, massive estate, perfectly on the absolute outskirts, entirely of the massive city. Completely, flawlessly equipped, and incredibly, highly secure. You can comfortably live perfectly there, absolutely, as long exactly as you desperately need. You will successfully possess the absolute best, highly elite medical care, absolute financial stability, absolutely everything that you and your innocent son highly actively require. You will absolutely lack completely nothing. The highly generous offer was so incredibly, massively astounding. So incredibly far, completely outside the highly normal realm entirely of exactly what was actively possible, that it violently sounded exactly like a highly toxic, lethal trap. And exactly what do you fiercely want completely, in absolute return? She asked, her highly protective suspicion violently returning. Absolutely no one actively does absolutely something exactly like that completely for absolute free. Gabriel's handsome expression remained utterly, completely unreadable. Matteo's absolute, massive greatest weakness has absolutely always been his highly toxic pride. He actively sees his biological son absolutely not exactly as a beautiful human being, but entirely as a highly valuable corporate asset. A highly necessary continuation entirely of his highly arrogant dynasty. He ruthlessly abandoned his biological son entirely for a highly lucrative business deal. But the exact, precise moment that innocent child is officially born, his highly toxic ego will aggressively demand that he violently possesses him. He will highly aggressively attempt to violently take him completely away, entirely from you. He confidently took exactly one massive step, significantly closer. His highly powerful presence completely filling the highly narrow, cheap threshold. My massive proposal is officially exactly this. I will generously give you absolutely all the highly massive resources you desperately need, entirely to fiercely protect your innocent son. In absolute, highly equal exchange, you generously permit me to actively help you flawlessly raise him. Generously let me flawlessly provide him entirely with the absolute security and the massive future that his highly toxic father has violently stolen completely from him. Generously let me absolutely be a highly impenetrable bulwark, completely between your beautiful family and Matteo Montejo. You desperately want to actively raise my biological son? She violently stammered, highly horrified and incredibly confused. I fiercely want to actively protect him, Gabriel smoothly corrected, and entirely and aggressively doing exactly so. I fiercely want to completely ensure that Matteo Montejo can absolutely never, ever successfully claim the massive legacy entirely of the exact man he ruthlessly betrayed. The innocent grandson entirely of Roberto Navarro will absolutely not be actively raised completely by a highly toxic man exactly like that. I will absolutely not generously permit it. It was a highly strange, almost highly archaic feudal pact. A massive deal, violently born entirely from absolute honor, massive revenge, and the highly lingering ghost entirely of a massive man they absolutely both had deeply admired. Lucia intensely looked directly at this highly powerful, incredibly enigmatic man. And she absolutely did not vividly see a highly terrifying threat, but a highly potential, massive lifeline. He was highly generously offering her and her unborn biological son an absolute, highly secure sanctuary. The highly terrifying alternative was the highly dangerous freezing streets. She deeply thought entirely about the highly cold, freezing humiliation entirely in the cheap supermarket. The highly damning, bright red letters entirely of the toxic eviction notice, and the highly chilling, terrifying words entirely of Matteo completely in the beautiful nursery. She had fiercely promised her innocent son that she would miraculously find a highly possible way. Perhaps this was officially it. A highly dangerous, incredibly unorthodox, highly desperate, massive way. There will absolutely be highly strict conditions, she stated firmly, actively testing him, her brilliant mind incredibly slowly, aggressively, beginning to flawlessly work completely again. My biological son will officially possess my absolute last name, Navarro, and I will officially be his absolute mother, his absolute only biological parent. You are officially an elite guardian, a highly generous benefactor, absolutely nothing, completely more. Gabriel nodded fiercely, enthusiastically accepting her highly strict terms completely, without a single ounce entirely of hesitation. Absolutely, of course. He is officially your biological son. I simply, highly respectfully, offer my absolute, highly impenetrable protection. Lucia took a massive, incredibly deep breath. A highly trembling, violently shuddering, massive inhalation. She was actively making a highly dangerous deal, completely with her highly toxic husband's absolute, massive greatest enemy. Actively entrusting her massive future and the beautiful future entirely of her innocent son. Completely to a highly terrifying man she literally barely even actively knew. It was a highly massive leap entirely of absolute faith, completely into a highly dark, terrifying abyss. But it was infinitely, significantly better than the highly certain, absolute ruin that violently awaited her. "Okay, Mr. Valdez," she stated firmly, fiercely meeting his highly intense, piercing gaze. "We officially possess a massive deal." Lucia accepts Gabriel's crazy offer to co-raise her child. Do you think he has ulterior motives? Share your theories below. The Fortress of Peace, the highly massive estate formerly called Valdez Estate, was significantly less a simple house, and infinitely more exactly like a highly impenetrable kingdom, flawlessly carved entirely into the highly lush, beautiful hills entirely of Mexico. A highly long, incredibly winding private driveway, heavily flanked entirely by highly ancient towering oak trees, flawlessly led directly to a highly majestic, massive gray stone mansion that beautifully overlooked a highly pristine, private lake. It was an absolute, highly impenetrable fortress, entirely of absolute tranquility and massive, elite wealth. An entire, massive world completely far, far away, entirely from the highly toxic dirt and blinding desperation, entirely of her highly pathetic apartment, entirely. In Brooklyn, Gabriel was completely, absolutely, highly faithful, entirely, to his highly honorable word. He was a highly discreet, incredibly respectful, absolute presence. He seamlessly installed her entirely in a highly beautiful, massive suite, entirely of luxury rooms, completely with highly stunning views, entirely of the highly meticulously manicured gardens. He aggressively organized a highly elite team, entirely of the absolute best, highly expensive prenatal doctors, entirely to actively make highly private house calls, and flawlessly ensured that she successfully possessed absolutely everything she could highly possibly ever desperately need. His highly elite staff was incredibly professional and incredibly kind, flawlessly led completely by a highly warm but incredibly sensible elite housekeeper explicitly named Mrs. Sierra Gomez. For the absolute first time, completely in agonizing months, Lucia could finally successfully breathe. She was perfectly, completely happy. Gabriel actively worked primarily completely from a highly massive, completely book-filled luxury office, entirely on the absolute ground floor, and their highly initial interactions were incredibly, highly formal. They highly occasionally peacefully shared a highly quiet, delicious dinner, completely during which he happily told her highly fascinating stories, entirely about her loving father, entirely in his highly early, struggling days. Highly entertaining tales, entirely about his highly sharp business acumen, his highly surprising, brilliant humor, and his absolute, highly unshakable faith entirely in good people. Entirely through Gabriel, Lucia profoundly felt a highly massive, beautiful connection completely with the loving father she so incredibly deeply missed, and she aggressively began to vividly see the true, genuine man completely behind the highly ruthless, terrifying corporate reputation. She vividly saw a highly powerful man entirely of highly profound loyalty, actively driven entirely by a highly strict, absolute personal code, entirely of massive honor. As the highly anticipated due date aggressively approached, a highly strange, beautifully quiet camaraderie miraculously grew completely between them. He would happily find her entirely in the massive library and highly silently, gently hand her a hot cup entirely of expensive decaf tea. She would carefully leave the highly complex business section entirely of the daily newspaper completely on his massive desk. Meticulously opened completely to a highly interesting article she genuinely thought he would highly actively find incredibly fascinating. They highly rarely ever explicitly spoke entirely of Mateo, but his highly toxic presence violently lingered exactly like highly lethal poison completely in the heavy air. The highly unspoken, massive reason entirely for their highly strange, powerful alliance. The highly terrifying night she finally, violently, went completely into active labor. A highly fierce, incredibly violent thunderstorm was aggressively raging completely outside, flawlessly mirroring the highly beautiful, massive chaos entirely of the impending birth. It was Gabriel who actively found her frantically breathing completely through a highly massive contraction entirely in the long hallway. His absolute composure was utterly, completely absolute. He gently, securely helped her completely into the highly armored car he absolutely already possessed, actively waiting, and softly spoke entirely to her, completely, with a highly calm, incredibly firm voice, completely, during the highly frantic drive directly to the highly exclusive, elite private hospital wing he had highly expensively reserved. He absolutely never, ever actively left the highly sterile waiting room. Matias Navarro was miraculously born exactly as the bright sun actively began to beautifully rise. The highly violent storm had absolutely already completely passed. He was incredibly tiny and absolutely, flawlessly perfect. Completely with a highly thick lock entirely of dark hair and the exact same highly intense blue eyes entirely of his brave mother. When the elite nurse gently brought him directly to Lucia, her fragile heart violently expanded completely with a massive love so incredibly fierce and highly all-encompassing that it completely, utterly eclipsed absolutely all the highly agonizing pain and massive betrayal entirely of the highly traumatic past year. He was absolutely hers. He was her absolute, pure reason entirely for absolutely everything. Significantly later that exact same day, she generously permitted Gabriel to actively see him. He stood perfectly still, entirely in the heavy doorway, entirely of the highly secure hospital room, visually looking incredibly hesitant, entirely for the absolute first time, completely since they had absolutely ever met. He visually looked highly incredibly, completely out entirely of place. A highly terrifying titan, entirely of elite industry, completely, utterly humbled, entirely by the highly innocent sight, entirely of a highly tiny, sleeping baby. Confidently come directly in, Gabriel, she stated incredibly softly. He slowly approached incredibly closely, completely to the expensive bassinet. His piercing gaze violently fixed completely on the tiny baby. He intensely looked directly at Matthias. His highly severe, sharp features beautifully softened completely into a highly profound expression, entirely of pure wonder. And absolutely something completely else. Absolutely something highly akin, completely, to absolute reverence. He visually looks exactly like you, Gabriel stated, his deep voice highly hushed completely in a soft whisper. He officially possesses my identical eyes, Lucia warmly agreed. But that highly intense, deep scowl is completely, 100%, absolutely yours. Gabriel gently extended exactly one single, massive finger and incredibly softly stroked the tiny baby's highly soft cheek. Matthias actively moved, but absolutely did not violently wake completely up. In that highly small, incredibly silent gesture, Lucia vividly saw the absolute, undeniable truth entirely of his massive promise. This absolutely wasn't entirely just highly toxic revenge completely against Matteo, or a massive debt completely to her loving father. This highly powerful, highly solitary man was completely, utterly captivated. Meanwhile, completely in massive Mexico City, Mateo Montejo and Sofia Castro were highly proudly, completely on the absolute glossy cover entirely of Vogue, highly ostentatiously showcasing their highly extravagant, massive wedding, flawlessly hailed exactly as the absolute, highly elite social event entirely of the massive year. The highly edited photos aggressively showed them entirely in their highly sterile, art-filled luxury apartment, highly falsely smiling entirely for the bright cameras. The absolute, highly perfect elite power couple. The highly lengthy article heavily mentioned their highly ambitious plans entirely for the massive future, completely for the highly dominant Montejo Castro dynasty. There was absolutely zero highly microscopic mention entirely of absolutely any child. Mateo highly aggressively found completely out, entirely about the massive birth completely through a highly elite, expensive private investigator he had aggressively hired to actively follow Lucia. The highly explosive news violently landed completely with a massive, heavy thud entirely in his chest. A biological son. He officially possessed a biological son. He intensely viewed the highly covert photos that the elite private investigator had highly secretly taken, completely from a highly safe distance. Lucia safely leaving the massive hospital, visually looking incredibly tired, but completely, utterly radiant. And Gabriel Valdez, his absolute, highly sworn massive enemy, highly protectively carrying the expensive baby car seat completely with a highly arrogant air entirely of absolute ownership. A highly black, incredibly toxic, massive possessive rage violently filled him. Valdez was aggressively, maliciously, meddling completely in his highly private affairs, actively touching exactly what was legally, biologically his. "What exactly is actively wrong, darling?" Sophia asked, confidently entering his massive study. Heavily dripping completely with highly expensive jewelry, completely from a highly elite party they were actively about to confidently attend. "Absolutely nothing," Matteo violently snapped, aggressively closing the expensive laptop. "Absolutely just a highly annoying, pathetic business nuisance." But it absolutely wasn't entirely just a highly pathetic nuisance. It was the highly toxic seed entirely of a highly dangerous, massive obsession. The biological son he had ruthlessly, violently ordered to be permanently erased was exactly now miraculously alive, perfectly well, and actively completely under the highly impenetrable protection entirely of his absolute greatest rival. The highly unexpected existence entirely of Matias Navarro was a highly toxic, messy loose end, entirely in the highly perfect, flawless tapestry, entirely of his massive, brand new life. And Mateo Montejo absolutely did not tolerate highly messy loose ends. For exactly right now, he would highly arrogantly ignore it. He would aggressively consolidate his massive power and happily enjoy his highly toxic victory. But he profoundly knew completely, with a highly terrifying certainty, that violently chilled him completely to the bone, that exactly one highly agonizing day, he would aggressively come to violently collect his highly valuable asset, back completely inside the highly quiet serenity entirely of Finca Valdez. Lucia intensely watched exactly as Gabriel highly securely held little Matias entirely for the absolute first time. His incredibly massive, highly capable hands, surprisingly, incredibly soft, a highly beautiful, brand new life had miraculously begun. Absolutely not the exact specific one she had meticulously planned, but exactly one miraculously forged, completely from the highly toxic ashes entirely of the old one. A beautiful life, flawlessly built, completely on a highly strange, massive foundation, entirely of absolute honor, pure gratitude, and a highly profound, beautifully shared love completely for the incredibly tiny boy who peacefully slept completely unaware entirely of the highly violent storm that had actively preceded his miraculous arrival, or the highly catastrophic one actively gathering completely on the massive horizon. Mateo is furious that Gabriel is raising his son. Do you think Gabriel will be a better father than Mateo? Share your thoughts below. The calm before the storm, the highly peaceful, following 6 beautiful years seamlessly passed entirely in an incredibly idyllic, beautiful quietness that physically felt entirely at once incredibly precious and highly precarious. Finca Valdez flawlessly became a highly impenetrable sanctuary, an absolute, massive world, completely unto itself, exactly where Matias Navarro could happily, safely grow up completely protected entirely from the highly toxic identity entirely of his biological father. For young Matias, Absolute home was the highly sprawling, massive estate, completely with its highly beautiful, secret gardens and its highly sparkling private lake. True family was his brave mother, Lucia, and the highly tall, incredibly quiet man he happily called Papa Gabriel, who, completely over massive time, miraculously became his absolute, true father entirely, in absolutely every single way that truly mattered. The highly profound transformation entirely of Gabriel was incredibly subtle, but highly massive. The highly freezing, incredibly calculating, ruthless businessman was absolutely still actively there, flawlessly directing his massive global empire completely from his luxury office, completely with highly lethal, ruthless efficiency. But the absolute, precise moment he confidently stepped completely out, entirely of that heavy room, he was absolutely, 100% Matthias's true father, entirely, in absolutely every single, meaningful way that truly mattered. He patiently taught the energetic boy exactly how to successfully skip flat stones completely across the private lake, their beautifully shared laughter loudly echoing completely in the highly crisp, fresh autumn air. He sat highly awkwardly, entirely, in a highly tiny, cheap chair, completely at a highly tiny table, entirely for highly imaginative, fake tea parties. His massive, highly imposing figure, highly comically completely out of place, completely with a highly serious, intense expression, entirely on his handsome face, exactly as he highly politely inquired entirely about the highly delicate health, entirely, of Matthias's favorite teddy bear, Sir Reginald. He happily read highly entertaining bedtime stories directly to him, his highly deep, booming baritone flawlessly giving highly dramatic voice completely to massive dragons and brave knights. His massive finger highly gently tracing the heavy words completely for the highly curious little boy, securely curled completely up right beside him. He absolutely never, ever aggressively overstepped. He absolutely always highly respectfully deferred completely to Lucia, entirely on absolutely all massive, major parenting decisions. But his highly pure, absolute devotion was completely, utterly absolute. He was absolutely right there entirely for every single, highly painful scraped knee. Every single, highly terrifying, feverish night. Every single, highly triumphant, colorful picture frantically scribbled completely with cheap crayons and highly proudly presented directly to him exactly as a highly priceless masterpiece. He was the highly solid, completely unshakable, massive rock, completely against which their highly small, beautiful family was flawlessly built. Lucia absolutely also miraculously flourished, with the highly constant encouragement and massive financial backing entirely of Gabriel. She happily returned completely to her absolute first true love, highly creative landscape architecture. She successfully started a highly elite boutique firm, actively working completely from a highly beautiful design studio that Gabriel had highly expensively built, completely for her, entirely and exactly one, entirely of the highly old, renovated carriage houses, completely on the massive estate. Her massive talent, exactly once a highly suppressed mere hobby, miraculously became a highly lucrative, highly successful massive business. She completely, beautifully regained her absolute independence and her highly true identity. Absolutely not exactly as the highly pathetic, discarded wife entirely of Mateo Montejo, but exactly as Lucia Navarro, a highly respected elite designer and a highly fierce, loving mother. The highly quiet, beautiful bond, completely between her and Gabriel, beautifully deepened completely into a highly profound, absolute friendship entirely of pure trust. A highly equal, massive partnership entirely in the absolute truest, most genuine sense entirely of the heavy word. The highly complex question entirely of romantic involvement absolutely never ever actively arose. Their beautifully shared, massive purpose, Matthias, was way too incredibly sacred entirely to be highly toxically complicated. In massive Mexico City, the highly toxic life entirely of Mateo Montejo was a highly disturbing, perfect mirror image entirely of theirs. Highly flawless completely on the massive outside, completely, utterly hollow, completely on the inside. The massive merger completely with Castro Telecom had successfully made him spectacularly, unimaginably wealthy, and terrifyingly powerful. An absolute king entirely in the massive concrete jungle. He and Sophia were highly regular fixtures entirely on the highly exclusive social scene. Their highly curated lives, a highly brilliant, fake representation entirely of pure marital bliss, but completely behind the highly secure, closed doors entirely of their highly sterile, minimalist penthouse. The absolute silence was completely deafening. Their highly strategic marriage was a highly cold business contract, and it possessed exactly one highly obvious, highly unfulfilled, massive clause. A massive heir. After agonizing years entirely of actively trying, entirely of highly invasive medical treatments and highly silent toxic disappointments, their highly expensive elite doctors officially delivered the absolute, highly final verdict. Sophia was completely, physically incapable entirely of successfully conceiving. The highly catastrophic news violently shattered the highly fragile truce entirely of their highly toxic relationship, flawlessly exposing its highly cold, transactional core. Mr. Castro aggressively began to intensely look directly at his arrogant son-in-law, completely, with highly undisguised toxic disappointment. A massive dynasty aggressively required a highly legitimate successor. It was exactly then that Mateo's highly toxic thoughts aggressively began to violently wander, to highly toxically fixate completely on the biological son he had ruthlessly, violently abandoned. The highly messy loose end was exactly now a highly energetic 6-year-old boy. His highly toxic obsession aggressively began highly small. He highly illegally paid his highly elite private investigator a highly exorbitant amount entirely of massive money, entirely for highly detailed updates. First violently came the highly detailed reports, then the highly covert photographs. He would intensely stare completely at them. Entirely for agonizing hours, completely in the highly early morning, completely with an expensive glass entirely of vintage whiskey securely in his hand. Exactly there was Matthias actively riding a small pony, Gabriel highly gently guiding him, a highly rare, highly genuine smile completely on the terrifying man's face. Exactly there was Matthias happily playing entirely on a playground swing, his loving mother enthusiastically pushing him, his beautiful face brilliantly lit completely up entirely with pure joy. Exactly there was Matthias entirely in a highly adorable school play, adorably dressed exactly as a highly leafy tree, completely with Gabriel and Lucia peacefully sitting entirely in the absolute front row, visually looking entirely in absolutely every single way exactly like a highly proud, highly normal family, and entirely and absolutely every single highly covert photo, he vividly saw a highly terrifying ghost entirely of himself. The exact shape entirely of the young boy's jaw. The exact way his highly dark hair flawlessly fell completely over his tiny forehead. This was officially his biological son. His pure blood, his massive legacy, and Gabriel Valdez was actively, happily raising him. The highly toxic thought was a highly vile, lethal poison, violently twisting his highly toxic pride completely into a highly tight knot, entirely of blinding, jealous fury. Valdez absolutely hadn't entirely just violently beaten him completely in highly competitive business. He had maliciously stolen his biological son, his absolute own massive immortality. He aggressively began to violently investigate, actively using his highly vast, massive resources entirely to aggressively unearth absolutely every single microscopic detail entirely of their beautiful lives. He horrifyingly learned Matthias's absolute favorite color, blue, his absolute favorite food, macaroni and cheese, and that he enthusiastically wanted to actively be an elite astronaut exactly when he successfully grew completely up. He profoundly knew the highly exact name entirely of Matthias's friendly teacher, and the highly specific name entirely of his absolute best friend. He violently became a highly toxic digital ghost, a highly creepy voyeur who aggressively spied entirely on the highly happy, beautiful life that he had violently, ruthlessly thrown completely overboard. The absolute breaking point violently arrived exactly on his highly anticipated 4th birthday. Sophia highly extravagantly threw him a highly lavish, massive party. A highly crowded room completely filled entirely with highly fake people who highly admired his massive wealth, but who absolutely knew nothing entirely about the true man, as they highly hypocritically toasted completely to his massive success. He vividly saw a highly brand new, highly covert photo entirely on his highly secure phone. It was entirely of Matthias, completely with a highly adorable, toothless smile entirely on his beautiful face, highly proudly holding a highly colorful, homemade birthday card. The highly clinical caption, entirely from the elite private investigator, explicitly read, "Target actively celebrating the highly happy birthday entirely of Gabriel Valdez." They were highly enthusiastically celebrating his absolute enemy. His biological son was happily calling his absolute enemy Dad. The highly toxic illusion entirely of his highly perfect life violently crumbled completely into toxic dust. The massive wealth, the highly toxic power, the highly beautiful fake wife, absolutely all entirely of it was completely, utterly insignificant. He absolutely no longer desperately wanted a massive dynasty. He violently wanted his biological son. The innocent child was absolutely no longer a highly messy complication, entirely to be violently erased, or a highly valuable asset entirely to be legally possessed, entirely in the highly twisted, toxic mind entirely of Matteo. Matthias had violently become the absolute, ultimate grand prize entirely of the absolute final, massive competition completely against Gabriel Valdez. And Mateo Montejo absolutely never, ever violently lost. He too aggressively picked completely buoying up his expensive phone and rapidly dialed the highly specific number entirely of the absolute most highly ruthless, highly terrifying family lawyer entirely in the massive state. "My name is officially Mateo Montejo," he stated, his deep voice exactly like freezing, clear ice. I desperately want to aggressively obtain absolute full legal custody entirely of my biological son. Matteo is suing for full custody of Matthias. Do you think he will win the legal battle against Gabriel? Share your theories. The war for a son. The highly massive legal documents aggressively arrived entirely on a highly crisp, cool October morning. Flawlessly delivered completely by a highly stone-faced elite courier. The highly massive thickness entirely of the heavy file was an absolute terrifying act, entirely of pure intimidation, entirely in itself. Lucia's soft hands violently trembled, exactly as she agonizingly read the highly toxic petition. Mateo Montejo versus Lucia Navarro. For absolute, total legal and highly physical custody entirely of Matias Navarro. The highly toxic petition was an absolute, highly fabricated work entirely of pure fiction. A highly toxic masterpiece entirely of highly malicious character assassination. It aggressively, highly falsely painted her exactly as a highly unstable, highly opportunistic gold digger who had completely, pathetically, fallen directly into the highly manipulative clutches entirely of Gabriel Valdez, a highly terrifying man, entirely of highly dubious character, who had highly insidiously, maliciously alienated the innocent child completely from his highly loving, natural father. It highly falsely portrayed Mateo exactly as the highly grieving, loving father, who, completely after a highly difficult period entirely of massive emotional upheaval, completely following their highly bitter, toxic divorce, was exactly now highly financially and highly emotionally, completely prepared entirely to flawlessly provide his biological son completely with the highly stable, incredibly loving home he truly deserved. It was completely stuffed entirely with highly toxic lies, malicious half-truths, and highly cruel, toxic inversions entirely of absolute reality. Gabriel agonizingly read it directly over her trembling shoulder. His handsome face violently hardened completely into solid granite. He absolutely isn't entirely just actively coming completely from Matthias, he stated, his deep voice a highly low, terrifying growl. He is actively coming completely for absolutely everything. He aggressively wants to completely, violently destroy us. The massive, highly explosive legal battle that violently followed was incredibly brutal and highly, highly public. Mateo highly toxically used the massive media exactly as his absolute own, highly personal weapon, aggressively leaking highly sanitized, heavily edited versions entirely of his highly toxic court documents directly to highly sleazy gossip columnists. The highly sensational headlines violently screamed completely from the cheap tabloids. Elite Titan actively in massive fight entirely to miraculously recover his biological son completely from rival billionaire. They were highly maliciously portrayed exactly as the highly toxic villains entirely in his highly carefully crafted, highly fake narrative. Mateo's highly elite lawyers were completely, utterly relentless. They highly aggressively subpoenaed Lucia's highly private financial records, her highly confidential post-divorce therapy notes, her highly complex business contracts. They highly aggressively interrogated Mrs. Gomez and completely other highly loyal staff members, desperately attempting to maliciously twist their highly fierce loyalty completely into highly damning evidence entirely of a massive conspiracy. They highly falsely argued that Finca Valdez was absolutely not a highly loving home, but a highly toxic, gilded prison, and that Gabriel's highly imposing presence was highly, actively detrimental completely to the innocent child's psychological development. The highly agonizing day that Lucia violently had to actively give her highly grueling deposition was exactly one entirely of the absolute worst massive days entirely of her entire life. For exactly 6 highly grueling hours, Mateo's absolute lead lawyer, a highly terrifying, ruthless shark completely in a $5,000 bespoke suit explicitly named Beatriz Romero, violently tore her beautiful life completely apart. Her highly personal choices, her highly absolute self-worth exactly as a loving mother. "Mrs. Navarro," Romero confidently began, her toxic voice heavily dripping completely with highly toxic condescension. "Isn't it absolutely undeniably true that you were completely, utterly penniless and actively entirely about to be violently evicted exactly when you highly eagerly accepted the highly generous, massive offer entirely from Mr. Valdez? I was actively in a highly desperate, difficult situation entirely because my highly toxic ex-husband highly illegally violently cut completely off my absolute access completely to absolutely all highly shared marital assets," Lucia sharply retorted, her beautiful voice highly firm entirely, despite the highly furious, violent beating entirely of her massive heart. "So, you highly enthusiastically entered completely into a highly massive financial agreement, completely with the highly well-known, absolute business enemy entirely of your highly toxic ex-husband, a highly lucrative agreement that flawlessly provided you completely with a highly luxurious life entirely in absolute exchange, entirely for exactly what exactly? The highly innocent affection entirely of your biological son? Did you actively make a highly toxic alliance entirely to fiercely protect your innocent son? Or did you maliciously, actively sell him?" Romero violently hissed. The massive, absolute cruelty entirely of the highly toxic question violently struck her completely with massive physical force. But she fiercely met the highly toxic lawyer's piercing gaze. "My innocent son is absolutely not a highly cheap commodity. That is a highly toxic, massive concept that you absolutely should extensively discuss completely with your highly toxic client." Gabriel, meanwhile, was actively waging a highly massive war completely on a highly different, massive front. He highly aggressively used his absolute own, highly formidable massive resources, absolutely not entirely to violently attack, but entirely to fiercely defend. His highly elite legal team was a highly silent, massive army, entirely of the absolute best. Highly brilliant legal minds entirely in the massive country. They flawlessly built a highly impenetrable fortress, entirely of massive evidence that meticulously documented the highly happy, incredibly stable, and highly richly fulfilling, beautiful life entirely of Matthias. They successfully possessed highly beautiful photos, engaging videos, highly excellent school reports, and highly glowing testimonies completely from friendly teachers, elite doctors, and highly loyal friends. Absolutely all flawlessly painting a highly beautiful picture entirely of a highly cherished, incredibly thriving young child. The highly explosive climax violently arrived entirely in the highly quiet, highly sterile, wood-paneled room, entirely of a highly secure, closed-door custody hearing. Mateo was confidently there, visually looking highly powerful and incredibly confident entirely in a highly dark, bespoke suit. Sophia, a highly silent, highly anxious, toxic statue, perfectly by his side. He confidently took the heavy stand and flawlessly delivered a highly impeccable, fake performance, highly eloquently speaking entirely of his highly profound, fake regret and his incredibly deep, highly enduring fake love completely for the biological son he had absolutely never, ever even met. Then, it was officially Gabriel's massive turn entirely to be highly aggressively interrogated. Beatrice Romero actively circled him exactly like a highly predatory raptor. "Mr. Valdez, you are absolutely not the biological father entirely of this innocent child. You officially possess absolutely zero biological rights, absolutely zero legal rights. Exactly what are you highly specifically completely to Matias Navarro?" Gabriel absolutely did not intensely look directly at the highly toxic lawyer, but entirely at the stern judge. His deep voice exactly when he finally spoke was incredibly calm and highly clear. Completely devoid entirely of the highly toxic anger they desperately attempted to violently provoke. "I am the absolute man who fiercely holds his tiny hand exactly when he is violently terrified entirely of the dark. I am the absolute man who enthusiastically cheers the absolute loudest entirely at his highly competitive soccer games. I am the absolute man who patiently explicitly explains completely to him exactly why the massive sky is beautifully blue. And the absolute man who enthusiastically listens completely to his highly funny jokes, even exactly when I absolutely already profoundly know the highly punchline." He violently paused. "You are 100% absolutely right. I officially possess absolutely zero biological claim. My highly absolute claim is flawlessly written completely in exactly 6 beautiful years, entirely of highly entertaining bedtime stories, lovingly bandaged scraped knees, and absolute, unconditional love. I am officially his true father entirely and absolutely every single way that truly matters. I am officially his papa." The highly explosive, absolute final blow, however, miraculously came completely from a highly unexpected, massive source. Gabriel's highly elite lawyers surprisingly called Sofia Castro Montejo directly to the heavy stand. Mateo's highly toxic team violently protested, incredibly furiously, but the stern judge generously allowed it. Sofia was incredibly pale, her highly toxic composure incredibly fragile. Gabriel's elite lawyer, a highly quiet and incredibly methodical man, smoothly approached her incredibly gently, exactly as if absolutely not to violently startle her. "Mrs. Castro Montejo, entirely in his highly toxic petition, your arrogant husband explicitly states his highly profound desire entirely to flawlessly provide a highly stable, highly secure, 2-parent home completely for his biological son. Do you actively share this highly profound desire?" Sofia violently hesitated. Her piercing eyes violently darted completely toward Mateo, who highly aggressively shot her a highly terrifying look entirely of pure, unadulterated threat. She took a highly trembling, incredibly deep breath. "Yes," she whispered incredibly softly. "And do you genuinely believe you can successfully provide that absolute stability, completely given the highly complex circumstances entirely of your highly toxic marriage?" "Yes." The elite lawyer violently paused, then smoothly placed a highly thick file completely on the heavy witness stand. "Then, can you highly possibly explicitly explain completely to the stern court the highly official documents that I officially possess completely in front entirely of me? The highly official ones, explicitly signed completely by you and your arrogant husband, highly legally contracting exactly one entirely of the absolute best, highly elite surrogacy agencies entirely in the massive country. Explicitly dated exactly 1 short week completely after you horrifyingly found completely out that Mr. Montejo successfully possessed a highly healthy biological son. The massive room went completely, utterly silent. Matteo completely, violently stiffened. "Your Honor," the elite lawyer aggressively continued, "Mr. Montejo has absolutely not been highly actively searching entirely for a beloved son. He has been actively, highly aggressively searching entirely for a massive heir. When it violently became incredibly clear that his highly toxic wife absolutely could not successfully provide him completely with exactly one, he highly callously turned completely to the biological son he had highly previously, ruthlessly discarded exactly as a highly messy loose end." He violently paused. "This absolutely is not entirely about pure love. It is entirely about highly toxic acquisition." Sophia sat completely frozen, staring blankly directly at the highly damning documents, then completely at her highly toxic husband. And absolutely something massive entirely inside her violently snapped. The agonizing years entirely of highly toxic emotional neglect, entirely of actively being a highly pathetic pawn, entirely in his highly arrogant dynastic ambitions. Absolutely all of it violently came completely to a highly explosive head. "He explicitly told me," she stated, her beautiful voice violently trembling, but miraculously finding a highly brand new, massive strength. "He explicitly told me that the innocent child was a highly pathetic mistake. He explicitly told me that Lucia was completely unfit. When he horrifyingly discovered that he was actively under the highly impenetrable protection entirely of Gabriel, he violently became completely obsessed. He explicitly said that he was the absolute, highly final piece entirely of his massive collection, that he would successfully own absolutely everything that Gabriel absolutely ever highly wanted. It was completely, permanently over. The highly toxic lie had absolutely been completely, violently exposed. Matteo's highly carefully, meticulously constructed fake narrative entirely of the highly repentant, loving father lay completely in shattered ruins, flawlessly revealing the highly freezing, highly grasping, toxic ambition completely underneath. The stern judge's highly official ruling was incredibly swift and completely withering, generously granting Lucia absolute, full legal custody, and highly legally issuing a highly permanent, strict restraining order completely against Matteo. His highly toxic visitation rights were completely, indefinitely suspended. He had completely catastrophically lost as she confidently exited the massive courthouse, happily blinking completely in the highly sudden, bright sunlight. Lucia vividly saw Matteo standing perfectly still, perfectly next, completely to his massive car. He visually looked incredibly diminished, his highly toxic power completely stripped entirely away, flawlessly leaving absolutely only a highly hollow, pathetic shell entirely of a man. Their piercing eyes fiercely met entirely for exactly one highly brief moment. And she profoundly felt absolutely nothing. Absolutely no toxic hatred. Absolutely no blinding anger. Absolutely not even highly pathetic pity. He was simply a highly pathetic stranger. A highly distant ghost entirely of a highly toxic life that was absolutely no longer hers. Gabriel smoothly placed a highly protective, massive arm completely around her soft shoulder, and they confidently walked completely away, ruthlessly leaving Matteo completely with the absolute ruin entirely of his absolute own, highly toxic creation. Gabriel and Lucia finally won. Do you think Gabriel's love for Matthias was what truly defeated Matteo? Share your final thoughts below. The true family. Significantly later that exact same night, completely back entirely at the highly peaceful estate, they lovingly tucked Matthias securely into his warm bed. "Papa," Matthias murmured highly sleepily. You successfully won your highly massive meeting completely today. Gabriel gently, lovingly smoothed the highly dark hair completely from Matthias's tiny forehead. Yes, my beautiful son, he stated, his deep voice incredibly thick completely with massive emotion. We successfully won. He and Lucia safely stood perfectly entirely in the quiet hallway, entirely for exactly one highly peaceful moment, the highly quiet, beautiful peace entirely of the massive house, beautifully settling completely around them. She gently reached completely out and softly took his massive hand. It absolutely wasn't a highly dramatic gesture, entirely of romantic romance, but entirely of absolutely something significantly, infinitely deeper. A highly massive partnership, absolute, pure gratitude, and a highly beautifully shared, completely unbreakable, massive bond. They had bravely faced the highly terrifying, massive storm completely together, and had miraculously, beautifully, completely into the highly peaceful calm. They were officially a highly true, beautiful family, absolutely not entirely of biological blood, but entirely of absolute, pure choice, and entirely in the highly quiet, massive fortress, entirely of Finca Valdez. They were finally, truly, completely home, and exactly so. The massive, highly toxic empire, meticulously built entirely on highly toxic lies, completely, violently, crumbled. And the highly beautiful family flawlessly built entirely on pure, unconditional love, proudly stood significantly stronger than absolutely ever before. Mateo Montejo agonizingly learned the absolute hardest, most highly brutal lesson entirely of all. That an innocent child is absolutely not a highly pathetic possession entirely to be toxically claimed. And that a highly true, beautiful family absolutely cannot be highly aggressively acquired completely through a highly toxic, hostile takeover. Lucia, Gabrielle, and little Matthias beautifully, flawlessly proved that the absolute truest, most beautiful bonds are absolutely not violently forged completely with biological blood, but entirely by absolute choice, by massive sacrifice, and completely by flawlessly showing completely up, absolutely every single beautiful day. Their massive, powerful story is a highly profound, beautiful reminder that absolutely, even completely, in the highly terrifying face, entirely of the absolute most highly cruel, toxic betrayal. Highly beautiful, brand new beginnings are absolutely, miraculously possible. And highly occasionally, the absolute, massive, greatest elite protector miraculously comes completely from the absolute most highly unexpected, massive place. What an absolutely incredible, breathtaking journey of resilience and chosen family. Did this massive story deeply touch your heart? Do you genuinely believe that true love and loyalty are thicker than blood? Tell me exactly what you thought of Gabriel's ultimate sacrifice in the comments below. If you fiercely loved this beautiful story of justice and hope, please smash that like button, share it with absolutely someone who loves a massive victory, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, life-changing stories. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.